Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous world of ancient Egyptian assassins. Those shadowy figures who slipped through temple corridors and sun-baked alleys to change the fate of dynasties with a bronze blade and a whisper. While popular fiction makes them look cool, the truth is, being an assassin in the land of the pharaohs seriously sucked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear, no one in ancient Egypt woke up and said, "You know what? I'd like to stab a high priest in the throat for a handful of copper deben and the honor of hiding in a grain silo for 3 days. Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like the last stop on the life went horribly wrong barge down the Nile. Most Egyptian assassins weren't mysterious loners trained in secret desert temples. They were desperate farmers facing famine, disgraced medjay, ex-tomb robbers with decent aim, or people so far off the scribes' records they could kill a man and still not be noticed in the census. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a healthy goat to your name, you were in management. But if you just escaped the quarries, had a reputation for solving problems, and could sneak into a crowded Theban market without being seen, congratulations. Someone somewhere was about to slide a pouch of rings across the table and whisper a name. And that name wasn't a fun one. You weren't asked to take out Beck, the quiet fisherman. It was usually a corrupt nomarch, a priest of Seth with too much gold, or someone with a dozen bodyguards and a fortified estate. The pay tempting, the job horrifying, but by the time someone considered it, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no guarantee of a proper burial. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No pension, no glory, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly hang up a papyrus scroll that said, "Quiet eliminations by appointment." You just had to stay quiet, move fast, and never ever tell anyone what you did for a living, especially not loudly over beer at a workers' tavern. Oh yeah, I'm a traveling merchant of exotic oils. The stains. Dye? So yes, nobody dreamed of being an Egyptian assassin. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spat them out wearing a simple linen kilt and holding a sharpened bronze dagger. You weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote on a papyrus scroll that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live to enjoy the coin. Let's burst the first myth wide open. Egyptian assassins didn't train under torchlight in some hidden tomb with wise mentors and inspirational chanting in the background. There was no montage, no teacher, no pep talk. If you learned anything, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. Most assassins weren't trained professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the ability to move quietly without sneezing. If you had military experience, great. That meant you knew how to hold a knife properly. If not, well, stabbing someone is fairly intuitive, but escaping afterward with both kidneys still intact. That takes skill or luck. Usually, just luck. There were no manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety briefings. You didn't get taught how to spot a body double or where viziers keep their bedroom exits. You figured it out while hanging from a palace windowsill, wondering if you just crept into the servants' quarters again. Poison? That was trial and error with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target just got mildly dizzy and more suspicious of his wine. Sometimes you drank the wrong cup. There was no ancient Egyptian poison control hotline. Just hope, herbal guesswork, and a strong stomach. Sure, if you were lucky, and I mean lottery lucky, you might have picked up some skills from tomb robbers or Nubian mercenaries. Maybe an older assassin showed you how to walk without making a sound on stone floors. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived because assassins don't retire. They disappear. Weapons training? Forget it. You weren't carrying a khopesh. You had a dagger you stole off a guard, maybe a strangling cord if you were feeling fancy, and whatever else fit under your kilt without making a sound. So, no, you weren't some shadowy martial arts master. You were a guy with calloused hands, quiet footsteps, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with dark temple corridors. Success didn't come from training. It came from survival. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, sloppily, then vanishing before anyone could sketch your face and chisel it onto a temple wall. In short, your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. Just bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping realization that you were very much on your own. Let's talk about why you became an assassin in the first place. Coin, cold, heavy, gleaming, deliciously spendable coin, or grain, or gold rings. The promise of it is what got you into this. But the reality, you got paid in lies. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term relationship. They want a one-time service, no papyrus trail, and ideally, no witnesses, including you. They offer you a pouch of copper rings, half now, half when the job is done. That's if they're feeling generous. But here's the thing. When the job is done is code for after we verify you didn't mess it up or make us look bad or leave a trail that leads back to us or survive long enough to tell anyone about it. So you do the job. You sneak through shadows, risk your life, maybe kill a no-march in his sleep. Not pretty, not poetic. And when you return, ah yes, about that payment, the client fled terribly sorry. Or worse, they try to kill you. A knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. And even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough. Not for the risk, not for the blood, not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a forgotten tomb with scorpions and moral regret. You get a handful of rings, a curt nod, and a reminder. You were never here. Also, fun fact, some contracts were fake. Political traps. You'd be told to assassinate someone dangerous only to find out it was a decoy with Medjay waiting. Congratulations. You just walked into a sting operation with your name already destined to be erased from memory. And even when the deal was real, you couldn't exactly go to the vizier's court and file a complaint. Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Senisret for breach of assassin contract. The only court you'd see was the one where you were the exhibit, likely on an impalement stake. So you learned to take what you could, demand payment up front, and trust absolutely no one. Not even the greasy little scribe who swore this job would change your life. It did, mostly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and vanishing before they broke you. So, you've taken the job. You've been lied to about the pay. You're probably going to die. Now, let's talk gear. Forget the fantasy stories and sneaky video games. There were no magical amulets of invisibility, smoke powders, enchanted daggers, or composite bows that folded neatly into your loincloth. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a simple linen kilt without clanking. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold ring in a dead man's sarcophagus lucky, you had a good bronze dagger. Not ornate, not curved like a serpent's tooth. Just sharp, hopefully not corroded, and ideally one that didn't smell like the last guy you stabbed with it. Poison? It existed, sure, but it wasn't as glamorous as a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most Egyptian poisons were unpredictable, made from desert plants, snake venom, or scorpion guts. Some worked instantly. Some took hours. Some made your victim vomit for 2 days and then recover. Angrier and now very suspicious of his beer. Ropes occasionally useful. You could strangle, climb, or tie something up with one, but you'd better know how to use it fast because nothing kills the mood like trying to wrestle someone while muttering, "Wait, which knot goes under again?" Bows. Effective, yes, if you had one, knew how to shoot it, and weren't trying to smuggle it through a palace disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations were up close and personal. No time for elegant marksmanship, just quick, quiet, and hopefully not messy enough to slip in. And you didn't get backups if your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well. Time to improvise. A sharpened piece of pottery, maybe. A rusty nail from a boat. Worth a shot. A belt buckle with intent. Desperate times. You carried your tools hidden in hems, sandals, or inside hollowed-out bread if needed. And you kept them close, not for safety, but because in this line of work, your weapon was your best friend, your boss, and your only retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no tinkering with gear between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You prayed to the silent gods it didn't betray you mid-strike, because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with a sharpened rock and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to take out random drunks in the workers' village. No one paid you to stab Gebu, the sleepy potter. Your targets were important. Viziers, high priests, military generals, sometimes even members of the pharaoh's own family. And those people, they were very hard to kill. First, there were the guards, not one or two, dozens. The medjay, armed, trained, and well-fed. Some guarded the front, some the back. Some just stood there looking intimidating, daring you to blink wrong. You'd spend days memorizing patrol patterns, door creaks, and exactly how many steps it took before the guard with the bad knee needed a breather. Second, there were walls. Palaces didn't have front porches. They had massive gates, archer posts, and high mud brick walls that seemed to touch the sun. If you didn't get spotted climbing, you still had to worry about arrow slits and watchful eyes from every rooftop. Your job description included may get turned into a pincushion for peeking. Third, there were the servants and staff, the cooks, scribes, and stable boys. One wrong look from you, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins weren't just fighting swords, they were fighting gossip. And ancient Egyptian gossip travels at light speed if it means someone gets to keep their head. And finally, your actual target, paranoid. Rightfully so. These people were surrounded by backstabbers, relatives with claims to their titles, and 36 people pretending to like them. They didn't eat without a taster. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door. Some even slept in decoy beds or rotated rooms like a deadly version of musical chairs. And don't get excited if you hear they're attending a festival. Yes, they'll be drunk, but so will you. And you'll still have to get past the royal guards, 3 dogs, a very alert courtier, and 50 witnesses holding beer cups. Even getting close to your target could take weeks. Posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, hiding in large pottery jars. And when the moment finally came, you had one shot. One precise, perfect, non-squeaky, non-bloody ghost vanish in the night moment. Or you'd become the next public deterrent swinging from an impalement stake with a sign that read, "Nice try." Let's be honest, when you picture an Egyptian assassin, you probably imagine sleek black linen, gold armbands, maybe a mysterious coal-lined eye peering from the shadows. Reality, you looked like a sickly farmer with something to hide. Disguises in ancient Egypt weren't exactly high fashion. You didn't have custom-tailored kilts or retractable bronze armor. You had whatever you could scavenge. A farmer's rags, a priest's linen robe 2 sizes too big, or the remains of a guard uniform that definitely still smelled like its previous owner. The goal was to blend in. But blending in meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in the Nile in 2 weeks, limped from old injuries, and had a nervous twitch from malnutrition. You didn't look suspicious because of your clothing. You looked suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in papyrus. And forget masks. There were no ceremonial options. Most face coverings just made you look like a leper, which was great for avoiding conversation, but terrible for entering palace grounds. If anyone asked who you were, you had to think fast. I'm Acolyte Nebu. I take care of silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Even assuming you made it past the guards, noble households weren't full of idiots. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially ones that fumbled serving trays and couldn't name the vizier's favorite cat. You were always one. I've never seen you before, away from being clubbed with a headrest. And if your disguise did work, congratulations. You now had to stay in character for hours while pretending not to notice all the very stab-worthy people wandering by. Also, wigs, they existed, but good ones were expensive. If you needed to look different, you were stuck smearing dirt on your face, squinting, and hoping no one got close enough to notice your accent was from the wrong gnome. The truth was, your disguise didn't protect you. It gave you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to be gone, invisible, or very, very convincing. And if anyone saw through it, well, let's just say, no one wants to be the assassin caught in the high priest's laundry room wearing a serving girl's tunic and holding a dagger, especially not on a feast day. In ancient Egypt, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. You didn't have a sidekick with a composite bow, a clever alchemist in a secret workshop, or a handler who gave you coded papyrus scrolls and warm encouragement. You had you, a rusty bronze dagger, and crippling trust issues. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could actually count on. And if there were whispers of a brotherhood of shadows, it was mostly tavern talk, fueled by beer and boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost in a tomb than another professional killer who wanted to network. Why the isolation? Because in your business, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every contact was a risk. Every loose tongue a potential path to the crocodiles. Even your client might not know your real name. And if they did, you were already planning your exit. Companionship. Laughable. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under your reed mat. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to. One mistake, one person recognizing you in a market in Memphis, and your whole life turned into a sprint for the nearest Nile barge. Even fellow criminals kept their distance. Tomb robbers and smugglers were sociable. You were that guy who makes people disappear. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a walking liability. No one wanted to share bread with someone whose occupation could attract a visit from the Medjay with scourges. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a corrupt priest. If you talked about your job, people assumed you were either lying or dangerous, and they weren't wrong. So, you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At beer houses, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes always scanning the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed more than a night. You didn't say your name unless someone paid you first. And even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being an Egyptian assassin meant perfecting the art of vanishing, not just in a crowd, but from every life you never got to have. Let's say you took the job. You planned your route. You bribed the right doorman. You disguised yourself as a very convincing temple attendant. And then you froze. Maybe the target turned around unexpectedly. Maybe they were with their child. Maybe you got the shakes at the worst possible moment and your knife hand trembled like a terrified gerbil. Guess what? You're now dead. Because failure for an Egyptian assassin wasn't a slap on the wrist or a bad performance review. It was a public, painful, and wildly theatrical death, often involving impalement, fire, being fed to crocodiles, or sharp bronze devices with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant blowing the whole operation. Your target lived and immediately told everyone that someone tried to murder them. Suddenly, you weren't a shadow. You were a wanted man with a detailed description and probably a crude sketch chiseled onto every temple pylon within 30 miles. And those guards you once snuck past, now they're motivated. Sometimes it wasn't even your target you had to worry about. It was your client. If you failed, you were no longer an asset. You were a liability, someone who could be tortured, interrogated, or worse. Talk. The very people who paid you would be the first to put out a second contract on you, and there were no second chances. No. Sorry. The blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You had one shot, one moment in time, and if you blew it, the best you could hope for was to die quickly before anyone found out who hired you. Failure also meant shame. the silent, humiliating kind. You didn't just fail to kill, you failed to be invisible, to be perfect, and for assassins, perfection was survival. Anything less might as well paint a target on your back and start practicing your final plea to Osiris. It didn't matter how many jobs you'd done before, no one cared that you succeeded 12 times. Because in this profession, you're only as good as your last kill, and if your last kill didn't happen, you'd better start running. So, you did it. The plan worked. The dagger struck true. No screams, no guards, just a clean drop to the floor and a very important person who now wasn't. Congratulations. Now run for your life, because being a successful assassin in ancient Egypt didn't mean sipping wine on a rooftop while the city of Thebes celebrates behind you. It meant fleeing through back alleys with someone's blood on your sandals and a dog already sniffing your trail. There was no victory lap, no post-job beer with colleagues, no casual debrief with your client. You didn't even get a moment to admire your work. The moment your blade struck, your new job became escaping everyone who now wants to murder you in increasingly creative ways. Guards coming, doors locked, a getaway boat tied up on the other side of town. You probably bleeding. You had to plan your exit before the kill. Routes, disguises, fallback safe houses. Maybe a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least didn't ask questions because the city would go on lockdown within minutes. No one wanted a scandal, and lockdown meant closed gates, armed checkpoints on the Nile, and a dozen angry medjay with spears who all just received your rough description and the phrase may be armed and extremely stabby. And let's talk about the client. Assuming they actually planned to pay you, they weren't going to meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a thank you scroll. They'd probably vanish too, because an assassin who just completed a job is the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You'd proven you could get into places others couldn't. So even when you succeeded, you walked away with coin in one hand and a giant target on your back. And what did you win? A week of sleeping in tombs, bribing ferry captains, shaving your head in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Ipu as you tried to blend in with priests heading east. Because success didn't mean survival. It meant starting the whole game over in a new city, under a new name with even more people looking for you this time. So yes, you made the kill. Now run like hell. If being an Egyptian assassin wasn't already miserable enough, poor, hunted, and sleeping in places that smelled like stagnant Nile water, you also had to deal with the wonderfully creative paranoia of the people around you. Because in ancient Egypt, assassins weren't just feared, they were considered cursed. To the average farmer, you weren't just a killer in a kilt. You were some unholy creature who whispered to Seth, the god of chaos, and smeared scorpion venom on your blade under a full moon. Why else would you be able to sneak past guards and vanish in the dark? Logic wasn't exactly popular back then, but superstition, oh, that was everywhere. Some believed assassins could use Heka, or magic, to shapeshift. Others claimed you were invisible unless bathed in holy water from the temple of Isis. One popular tale suggested assassins made pacts with desert spirits and could breathe death through walls. Imagine walking through a village and hearing a woman mutter, "Don't make eye contact." He might curse the baby. Even your tools were suspect. Carrying a dagger. Clearly, it was forged in a cursed fire. Using poison, that wasn't chemistry. That was dark magic. And you probably stirred it with a severed finger under a blood moon. You'd think this fear might help you. After all, people avoided you, right? But the reality was worse. Superstitious mobs don't hesitate. They don't ask questions. They throw stones, set fires, and shout things like, "Destroy him before he calls a plague of locusts." Your reputation made people overreact. The second someone died unexpectedly, illness, accident, choking on a fig, someone would whisper, "Maybe it was a shadow man. Maybe it was him." You could be hunted just for existing in the same village as a suspicious death. That meant you had to keep moving. Always. Stay too long and suddenly a priest is ringing a bell while 5 angry farmers hold sharpened hoes like they've been waiting for this moment their entire lives. And heaven help you if you were caught with anything remotely weird. Dried herbs, strange amulets, or even a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to shout sorcerer and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too fast made you a threat. And in ancient Egyptian logic, threats had to die quickly and preferably fed to the crocodiles. Ah, poison, the assassin's weapon of elegance. A quiet kill, no mess, no screaming, no bronze on bone, just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and done. That's the theory. In practice, poisoning someone in ancient Egypt was like trying to win a bar fight with herbal tea and a bad attitude. First off, poisons weren't reliable. You didn't have access to purified arsenic or a neat little pill labeled fast-acting doom. You had plants, mushrooms, snake venom, maybe the occasional poisonous toad. You had to gather, grind, and pray to the gods of chaos. And even then, it might just give the target a stomach ache and a renewed commitment to his anti-assassin guard team. There was no scientific measurement. You didn't dose precisely. You eyeballed it. A pinch too little, and the noble just vomits and cancels dinner. A pinch too much, and you die from exposure before the first course is served. Also, ancient Egyptian kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't just waltz in and season the stew with nightshade. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in while no one was watching, or worst of all, try to poison a meal that would go through 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they didn't just eat food. They treated it like a military operation. Meals were tasted, blessed, and sniffed by everyone from the steward to the court jester. By the time the food hit their plate, it had passed through more security than a royal tomb. Even assuming you did it, you slipped in the poison. It wasn't detected, and the target actually ate it. The next part was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, some took days. One minute your mark is laughing at a joke, the next he's clutching his stomach and demanding to see his astrologer. And if they survived, guess who they'd blame? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the quiet man with the herbal knowledge and twitchy eyes. So poisoning wasn't efficient. It was risky, slow, and full of variables, none of them in your favor. And if you were caught, you didn't get a quick death. You got interrogated with tools until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the vizier to the dog. You'd think that if you successfully changed the course of history by removing a tyrant, sabotaging a royal bloodline, or silencing a political threat, someone would remember your name. Nope, you were an assassin. That meant your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a rumor, a shadow from the desert, a foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet man who never finished his beer. You might have pulled off the most legendary hit of the dynasty and still ended up as a mysterious death in the official record. In fact, that was the point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew who did it, the safer they were, and the less likely they were to end up poisoned by their own assassin. So, your name was buried the moment the job was done. If you even used a real one, you didn't sign your work. You didn't brag. You didn't keep trophies. You didn't exist outside the moment of the kill. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had a very short shelf life. And forget about honor. There were no medals for silence. No stone monuments for the man who stopped a war with one dagger in the night. If a noble wanted a statue, they commissioned one for themselves. You got a shallow grave, an unmarked spot in the sand, or if things went really badly, a head on a spike labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be cursed. You'd become a whispered warning. Don't cross the Pharaoh. Remember what happened to the Nomarch Anktifi? Yes. And the man who did it, gone like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame, not fear, just absence. You weren't supposed to leave a mark. In a culture obsessed with eternal life and the preservation of one's name, you were supposed to vanish. And if you stuck around long enough to be known, that was a fatal mistake, because in ancient Egypt, pharaohs got remembered, assassins got erased. So you survived. You got the job done. You even managed to get paid. A miracle in itself. Now all you have to do is lay low, keep your head down, and trust that your client will honor the deal and protect your identity. Right? Wrong. Because in the world of Egyptian assassination, there was one rule even more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person paying you. Your client, be they a vizier, a merchant, or a high priest with ambition and very loose morals, didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because they needed something awful done, and you were the sharpest tool in the shadows. Once the job was complete, you became a liability. You knew too much. You knew who wanted who, dead, when, why, and possibly how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to them. So, what did they do? They ghosted you. They denied they ever met you. Or worse, they sent someone else after you to clean up to tie off the contract with something sharper than a reed pen. There were even cases where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin to do the job and another to kill the first one immediately after. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared try to blackmail a client, threaten to expose them, that was bold. And also your final mistake, because powerful people in ancient Egypt didn't negotiate with assassins. They crushed them. If your client had a shred of honor, a rare species indeed, you might get paid and left alone. But even then, you'd still have to assume they were watching you from a distance with someone already sharpening bronze and memorizing your walk. You were the secret that couldn't talk, the shadow that couldn't stay. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust, because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. And no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived the kills, the lies, the poisonings, the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own sense of morality. Now what? You retire? Absolutely not, because in ancient Egypt, assassins didn't get retirement plans. There were no farewell banquets, no quiet huts by the Nile, no pensions paid in sacks of grain and grateful whispers. You didn't fade into a peaceful life. You vanished or you died, often both. The problem was simple. You were never safe. Even if you walked away from the job, your past didn't. You had too many secrets in your head, too many names in your memory, and too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried in an unmarked grave. And even if no one came after you, and that's a big if, you had to live with a constant fear that someone might. That a new assassin, young and eager to prove himself, had just received a contract for a shadowy figure who used to be someone dangerous. So, you changed your name again. You moved to a village where no one asked questions. You faked a limp, sold herbs, pretended you once worked as a guard on a Nile barge. But even then, you didn't sleep well. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger under the floor mat, next to the pouch of rings you never touched, because it still smelled like the man you earned it from. And you couldn't trust yourself either. Years of silent killings and quick escapes did something to your soul, your ba and ka. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize you. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loud. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man. The truth was, there was no endgame for an Egyptian assassin, just a slow, cold fade into obscurity. Always moving, always watching, until one day you slipped into the dark and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, you've probably figured it out. Being an Egyptian assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even all that profitable. It was a grim, thankless, short-lived career wrapped in blood-stained linen and followed by a crowd of people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last, not a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with the wrong assumptions. That you'd be sleek, in control, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd really be is hot, hungry, and one bad guess away from the crocodiles. You'd slip into Thebes, kilt pulled tight, ready for action, only to discover that your target moved locations. The guards are drunk but trigger happy. And the stable boy you paid for information just sold you out for a jug of beer and a piece of bread. You'd freeze at the wrong time, stab the wrong guy, get spotted by someone's maid who once saw your face near the temple, and suddenly you're not a shadow. You're the problem. Then what? You run. But you're not used to Egyptian terrain. The mud of the riverbank, the uneven stone pathways, the absolutely insane number of loose chickens in the street. You slip, fall, get tackled by a medjay named Thomas who just got dumped and is looking for an outlet. And let's say you survive that. Then you deal with the aftermath. No allies, no honor, and no future. Just whispers, suspicion, and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still believes in river spirits. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try because the assassin's life wasn't cool. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spat out nothing but shadows. It offered power without peace and purpose, without a place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question because no one even remembered you were there in the first place. Before she was the feared serpent of Thebes, Neferure was known as a minor priestess from the sun-scorched nome of Abydos. Her people claimed descent from scorpion kings of old. And whether or not the blood of ancient rulers truly ran in her veins, one thing was certain. This was not a woman born for the sidelines of history. From a young age, Neferure was steeped in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not just by politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a reverence for the fiercer gods. She wasn't the type of priestess who smiled and chanted hymns to Isis. No, she was drawn to cobras, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Sekhmet, where devotees danced barefoot in the moonlight and called upon the divine in states of trance. Her connection to the gods wasn't performative. It was personal. She didn't merely worship, she embodied. According to temple whispers, likely spread by men both terrified and enthralled, she kept sacred cobras in her chambers and even allowed them to coil beside her in bed. Whether this was a literal fact or the kind of slander that powerful women attract like flies, we'll never know. But it stuck. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her real power began not in a battlefield or throne room, but in the uneasy flicker of torchlight among the whispers of acolytes and the curling bodies of serpents. She wasn't just a priestess. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than bronze. So when the vizier Amenhotep, brutal, brilliant, and famously ambitious, arrived at the temple of Abydos for a religious festival, he didn't just meet a beautiful priestess. He met a mystery he couldn't resist. Their alliance wasn't just political. It was a collision of prophecy and power. And from the very beginning, it was full of omens. Some said a shadow in the shape of a hawk crossed the sun on their day of contract. Others claimed Neferure dreamed of a cobra entering her womb. All of it would become legend. But one thing is certain. The union of Neferure and Amenhotep didn't just create a child. It created a new power in Thebes, and she intended to shape its destiny from the very first breath. Neferure's alliance with the vizier Amenhotep was not the fairy tale one might expect for a priestess who would one day give birth to a potential heir to power. From the beginning, it was a combustible mix of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Amenhotep, ruthless, charismatic, and already collecting political allies like amulets, aligned with Neferure around 1370 BCE. She was likely just a young woman, but she wasn't naive. She saw in Amenhotep a man whose ambition matched her own, and perhaps even a divine match for her spiritual destiny. Thebes wasn't exactly an easy court to walk into. It was a land of gold and ambition where viziers were replaced by rivals and nomarchs turned into enemies overnight. But Neferur, the priestess of Abydos, walked in with her head held high and eyes already on the heart of power. Their alliance was rocky from the start. Amenhotep, for all his political genius, was not built for singular loyalty. He would go on to form multiple alliances, often for political gain, always for power. But Neferur wasn't one to sit quietly in the shadows of the temple. She held her own court, maintained her own network of priests, and was known to turn to oracles and rites to divine her future, and perhaps Amenhotep's fate. Then came the birth of their son. Even that was wrapped in celestial drama. Legends say Neferur dreamed that a scorpion of gold stung her womb, and that flames danced around her child without burning him. Amenhotep reportedly had a vision of sealing his private chambers with a carving of a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they believed these visions or invented them, they certainly acted as if their son was destined to rule not just a province, but the very heart of the two lands. But even as the child was celebrated, cracks in the political marriage deepened. Neferure resented Amenhotep's other allies, especially his new alliance with the powerful family of a Theban general, sealed by marriage. This was more than a domestic issue. It was a threat. The general's family was pure Theban nobility, and any heir they produced would be pure in the eyes of the local elite. A direct threat to her son's future. Neferur saw it clearly. The court wasn't just a home, it was a battlefield. And she would use every snake, dream, ritual, and whisper she had to make sure her son wasn't just remembered, but crowned with power. She was no longer just a priestess. She was the serpent of Thebes now, and no one would take her son's future without facing her wrath. By the time her son was a teenager, the vizier's palace in Thebes had become a war zone of veiled insults, political maneuvering, and bitter rivalries. Neferur wasn't just fighting for influence. She was fighting for survival. She knew that the court was filled with snakes, but she was the one who taught them how to bite. The vizier Amenhotep had begun to distance himself from her. He was politicking more, feasting more, and perhaps worst of all, listening more to his Theban advisors. The final blow came when he formally allied with a young noblewoman from a powerful military family. This new ally was pure Theban, and her uncle was one of the pharaoh's top generals. To Neferur, it wasn't just betrayal. It was a declaration of war. The announcement ceremony was a disaster. At the feast, the general's uncle drunkenly mocked Neferur and her son, calling into question the legitimacy of the boy's divine favor. Was he really blessed by the gods, or was he the child of a provincial priestess, as Neferur's enemies liked to claim? It was meant as an insult, but Neferur seized the myth. Let them whisper. Let them believe her son was touched by Sekhmet. It made him untouchable. Her son stormed out of the feast. Neferur left Thebes entirely, retreating to her temple complex at Abydos. But her exile was not defeat. It was strategy. In her home nome, she was still royalty. She could gather support, whisper in ears, and watch as Amenhotep's court began to rot from within. She didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then came the shock wave. The vizier was assassinated in his own garden, just as he was about to be elevated by the pharaoh. Just as he was on the verge of becoming the most powerful man in Egypt, second only to the god-king himself. The question that echoed through every papyrus-filled office and torch-lit hall was the same. Who did it? Was it a rival courtier, the jilted bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it the result of court intrigue? Was it the son himself? Or whisper it softly. Was it Neferur? No one could prove it. No one dared, but many believed it. After all, within days, the new noble ally and her infant child were dead. A sudden illness, some say, sent by Neferur herself. The serpent had returned to Thebes, and now nothing stood between her son and his inheritance. With Amenhotep dead and Thebes in mourning or confusion, Neferurer made her move. While others scrambled to understand the chaos, she acted swiftly, brutally, decisively. First, the young noblewoman, the rival wife from the powerful military family, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Neferurer didn't just have her killed. She made her death symbolic, public, humiliating. Some say the woman was forced to drink poison after watching her infant daughter be smothered. Others claim Neferurer had the child abandoned in the desert. What's agreed upon is this: no mercy was shown. Neferurer understood what many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a liability. A rival child, no matter how small, is a future war. And Neferurer was done playing defense. With her rival and her bloodline erased, she could turn her attention to securing her son's position. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, already trained by scribes and priests, was declared the rightful heir to his father's titles and estates without serious opposition. But don't be fooled. It wasn't just his charisma or his father's legacy that made it possible. It was Neferurer. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to quietly remove. She wasn't just protecting her son's rise, she was engineering it. Her son himself didn't always approve. He reportedly disapproved of the violence against the rival family. But he also didn't stop it because deep down he knew what Neferurer had always known. Power demands blood. And in Thebes, bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse. With her son now a powerful nobleman, Neferurer began to recede slightly from public life. But this was no retirement. She simply shifted from open strikes to whispered influence. As her son began his career in the pharaoh's court, she remained behind, not as a passive mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred amulets, consulted oracles, and performed rituals on his behalf. To Neferurer, her son's mission wasn't just political, it was divine. Her son wasn't just climbing the ladder of power, he was fulfilling prophecy. And as long as she drew breath, no rival, Theban, Memphite, or otherwise, would derail that divine plan. She had secured her son's inheritance. She had cleansed the court. Now she would guard his power from behind the curtain with teeth bared. As her son rose through the ranks to become a great power in Egypt, Neferurer remained behind in her temple complex. A priestess without an official title in Thebes, but not without power. Her informal role was chief advisor. But make no mistake, she ruled his network in all but name. Though day-to-day administration was technically handed to a loyal steward, one of her son's trusted men, Neferurer refused to be sidelined. She wrote letters to her son, constantly advising, warning, sometimes chastising him. These weren't the sweet letters of a doting mother. They were political briefings, laced with oracles and venom. And her son, hundreds of miles away, read every word. She reminded him who his true enemies were. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She criticized his fascination with foreign customs, his choice of allies, and his flirtation with challenging the high priests of Amun. No one else dared say these things to him. But Neferurer was never afraid to speak as a mother or a priestess of divine will. Back in Thebes, the captain of the Medjay grew increasingly resentful. Neferurer undermined him at every turn. She used her status, her religious authority, and her family ties to stir opposition against him. She had influence in Abydos, in the priesthood, and among the provincial aristocracy. She could spread rumors like wildfire, and with Neferurer, a whisper could be deadlier than a bronze sword. Meanwhile, her letters to her son became more urgent. She warned him of the Medjay captain's ambition, painting him as a second threat, ready to betray and usurp. Whether she truly believed it or simply feared losing her grip, she kept pressing her son to act. Her son, however, hesitated. He needed the Medjay to keep order in Thebes while he was away on Pharaoh's business. And so the rift between mother and general widened. Neferure watched. She waited. But beneath her religious robes and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She hadn't endured years of court warfare to be ruled over by an old soldier. As her son's influence stretched from the delta to Nubia, Neferure saw cracks forming. He was taking on too much, trusting too many new courtiers, and drifting away from the mother and the gods that made him. She believed his victories came from divine favor and from her. And if he forgot that, well, Neferure knew how to remind great men who they really were, even if that man was her own son. When news of her son's death in a border skirmish reached Abydos in 1350 BCE, it didn't arrive like a messenger. It arrived like a dagger. For Neferure, it wasn't just the loss of a son. It was the collapse of a world she had spent decades building. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied, raised, unleashed, was gone. And he'd left behind no clear heir, no single successor, only chaos. The mighty power base he carved out was already fracturing. His lieutenants, his so-called successors, were already dividing it up like jackals around a corpse. The Medjay captain still held power in Thebes, and he had no love for Neferure. Worse, her granddaughter, her son's only child, was being courted by rival nobles for marriage, each one hoping to use her bloodline as a claim to the family's wealth and titles. Neferure saw what was coming. Civil war within the court wasn't a possibility. It was inevitable, and once again she would have to act. But she no longer had her son. What she had instead was his bloodline, his young daughter, born to the wife her son had married. The wife, still in Thebes, was vulnerable. The girl was even more so. Neferure recognized that the child was now the last true piece of her son's legacy, and that made her a target, but it also made her a weapon. She allied herself with her daughter-in-law and the girl, determined to protect them and use the child's birthright to stake her own claim in the political battlefield. But the tide was turning. The nobles who once bowed to her son had no interest in kneeling to his widow or his mother. They had estates now, ambitions, and grudges. Neferure didn't flinch. She'd faced snakes, traitors, and viziers. A few warlords with titles and stolen authority wouldn't scare her. So she plotted. She waited. She watched as the old Medjay captain died and was replaced by his son, a man with ice in his veins and no tolerance for the old priestess's games. It was only a matter of time before these two forces collided, the serpent mother of a fallen dynasty and the cold-eyed usurper who wanted her buried. Her son was gone, but his shadow was still moving, and Neferure was still coiled within it, ready to strike. Years after her son's death, while his legacy crumbled into infighting, Neferure made her most audacious move yet. She returned to Thebes, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force of divine fury. The power structure had been splintered. The new Medjay captain, the son of her old enemy, was seizing power, and her daughter-in-law, along with the young granddaughter, was effectively imprisoned. Neferure saw the writing on the wall. If she did not act now, her grandchild would vanish like a shadow at dusk. So she made a deal with a rival nomarch, an aging lord who still held a flicker of legitimate authority from the pharaoh. Neferure would return, not to plead, but to rule her family's faction. With the nomarch's backing, she entered Thebes at the head of an army of retainers. And the moment her feet touched home soil, everything changed. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected to her side. Even some of her old enemies hesitated. Neferure, despite her age, was still a name that shook the ground. Then came her vengeance. One by one, she hunted down the loyalists of the Medjay captain. And when she finally caught his chief lieutenant, a puppet noble propped up by the captain, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife was captured and given the opportunity to kill herself with an asp. When she refused, Neferure had her strangled. It was brutality veiled in royal protocol, and Neferure, ever theatrical, staged the scene like a goddess delivering justice. Her message was clear: only the bloodline of her son had the right to rule his legacy. Everyone else was a pretender. For a brief, burning moment, Neferure held the faction in her grip. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged betrayals. She had reminded Thebes what real power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Thebes was like fire in dry papyrus. And the Medjay captain was still out there calculating, biding his time. He returned with a vengeance. His army outnumbered hers, his resources deeper, his cruelty colder. Her allies began to abandon her. The nomarch lost influence. The tide turned. Neferure, now isolated in her fortified city villa, watched as her enemies closed in. She had lit the match. Thebes had burned, and now the smoke was thick, and her enemies were at the gates. Neferure, once the most feared woman in Upper Egypt, now found herself besieged in her fortified villa in Thebes, alone, cut off, surrounded by the forces of the Medjay captain, who had come to finish what his father had started. But Neferure didn't beg. She didn't plead. For nearly a year, she endured the siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food ran short. Disease crept in. Allies vanished. Yet within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unshakable presence that had once shaken viziers. To the very end, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a dynasty. The Medjay captain, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew killing Neferure was dangerous. Even now, she carried a myth around her like armor. She was still the serpent of Thebes. To strike her down might seem like blasphemy. So, he offered her safety. Surrender, he said, and her life would be spared. Neferure knew better. She had seen too many promises from powerful men turn to ash. Still, hunger was no longer just a discomfort. It was death. Her garrison broke, her followers surrendered, and Neferure, unbending until the very end, was finally handed over to her enemies. The captain didn't kill her himself. That would have been too simple and too merciful. Instead, he turned her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. They condemned her to death. But here's the catch. When the executioners came, no one dared strike the first blow. Neferure stood tall, regal, silent, eyes fixed on them like an oracle staring through smoke. These were Thebans. They had grown up hearing of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They had once bowed to her son as a great lord. And now, here she stood, a frail old woman cloaked in myth, and not a single man had the courage to swing the axe. So the captain sent others, foreigners, Nubian mercenaries, people who had no memory of her power, only orders to follow. And thus Neferure was finally struck down, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of her bloodline in any meaningful power, and with it, the final ember of a dynasty founded on divine ambition was snuffed out. But even in death, Neferure left behind a shadow, and history would never forget the serpent priestess. Neferure died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once ruled. But history is strange. It does not always favor the ones who die in linen sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing. And Neferure was never meant for quiet history. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a sword and prophecy like a shield. She wasn't just the mother of a great lord. She was one of the architects of his rise. Without her, there is no myth of the divine child, no rituals whispering of scorpions and lions, no ruthless purging of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage noble to seize his father's power. Neferure didn't just give birth to an heir. She defended his legacy with claws. Yet, even among the ancient world's most ruthless dynasts, Neferure stands apart. She didn't command armies in the field like Hatshepsut or ride into battle like a warrior queen. Her battlefield was subtler and colder. It was a world of poisoned goblets, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear, and even more importantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and she may have believed it herself. Her enemies branded her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they weren't wrong. Neferur was all those things and more. She was the product of a brutal world that respected cunning far more than kindness. And she learned early that mercy was a luxury priestesses couldn't afford. In the centuries that followed, she was both vilified and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary. But no historian, ancient or modern, could call her irrelevant. She haunted the legacy of her family like a phantom, always in the background, always just behind the curtain. And maybe that's exactly where she belonged. Not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a great man's story, but as a story unto herself. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, slept beside snakes, and outlived gods. Neferure's bones turned to dust long ago, but her legend endures in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-borne destiny, in every dynasty built on myth. She is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting. On the sun-scorched edge of the Theban necropolis, just a few miles west of the modern city of Luxor, lies a ruin that feels more like a nightmare than a real place. Stone corridors snake in all directions. Rooms twist and double back. Staircases lead nowhere. It's easy to lose your sense of direction even today. This place is whispered to be the Tomb of Shadows, the heart of a forgotten death cult, and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in Egyptian lore, the Labyrinth of Souls. But before there was a legend, there was a complex unlike any other. Begun as a minor noble's tomb around 1500 BCE and expanded over centuries, the Tomb of Shadows wasn't just a burial site. It was an entire city of the dead under one cliff face, covering nearly 150,000 square feet. It featured over 1,000 chambers, light wells, hidden storerooms, dark shrines, workshops, and what may have been the first booby-trapped corridors in history. It had false floors, multi-story shafts, and an intricate system of sound tunnels to amplify footsteps. This wasn't a noble tomb, it was an architectural masterpiece of paranoia. To modern archaeologists, it looks like organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it probably felt like a gateway to the underworld. The man who brought the Tomb of Shadows into modern awareness was British Egyptologist Reginald Croft. In the early 1900s, Croft excavated the site and quickly became convinced that this was the origin of the local labyrinth myth. The layout was disorienting, the architecture deeply symbolic, and everywhere he turned, he found motifs of serpents and daggers painted on walls, carved into stone, or fashioned into small bronze charms. The serpent, after all, was a symbol of both death and rebirth to these forgotten people. Croft even went so far as to name the cult after the mythical demon god Medjed, the Smiter. Whether Medjed was real or not, his legend became inseparable from the ruins. But here's the twist. No one's found a literal demon, no underground god, no prison for souls, no half-man monster. What we have instead is something far more mysterious. A city of tombs designed in loops, wings, and layers, deliberately difficult to navigate. And the deeper you go, the more the lines between history and mythology blur. So the question remains, was the myth of the Labyrinth of Souls born from these walls, or was the tomb complex itself the monster? The Tomb of Shadows may not give up its answers easily, but it's very good at making us ask the right questions. The myth is as famous as the ruin, a monstrous demon god, the Smiter, trapped in a labyrinth so complex that no soul who entered ever found their way out. Only the purest of heart, a hero guided by the light of Ma'at, managed to appease the beast and escape thanks to a magic spell and the cunning of a priestess of Isis. But where did this story come from? And why a labyrinth? The earliest versions of the myth speak of a hidden cult, powerful servants of chaos who demanded tribute from local villages in the form of food, gold, and sometimes human lives. These unfortunate souls were sacrificed to the smiter, a creature born from divine punishment and shame. The smiter, locked in an underground maze, symbolized the dark underbelly of religion, something savage hidden behind piety. To ancient Egyptians, the western desert had long been a land of wealth, mystery, and fear. Its silent people, the tomb guardians and hermits, were seen as both devout and alien. Their rituals involved secret rites, their artwork depicted strange gods, and their tombs were unlike anything on the Nile's east bank. To a visiting scribe from 1000 BCE, the Tomb of Shadows might have felt like another world. The serpent itself was sacred in this cult's culture. Frescoes show masked priests handling cobras in ritual displays. Daggers of consecration, stylized bronze blades, appear on altars. Combine this with a tomb complex that feels like a maze, and the ingredients for a legend begin to stir. But what if the smiter wasn't just a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some scholars believe the tale reflects a memory of a time when a powerful, secretive cult did hold sway over the Theban necropolis, a time when local villages truly did pay tribute to a stronger, stranger power. The labyrinth could symbolize the political entrapment of weaker communities, and the smiter, the raw, terrifying force behind the cult's rule. Others argue it's more psychological, the labyrinth as the unconscious mind, the smiter as our hidden fears, and the hero walking bravely into the darkness, guided only by the thread of memory and faith. Still, the myth remains tangled with the Tomb of Shadows. The complex is the closest thing we've ever found to a real labyrinth. No monster, no priestess, but perhaps something deeper. Not just a myth echoing through history, but a history that was asking to become myth. Long before the Greeks raised their marble temples or the Romans sharpened their spears, there was this hidden society, one of the earliest professional organizations of killers in the world. They ruled not through conquest, but through fear, secrecy, and what seems like an almost supernatural command of architecture. At the heart of their power stood the Tomb of Shadows, a complex that wasn't just a headquarters. It was a hub of ritual, training, and a dark economy of death. The cult flourished from around 1500 to 1100 BCE. Based in Thebes, they developed a sprawling intelligence network that reached Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Anatolia. Their agents slipped through the ancient world like silent arrows, trading information, secrets, and death for gold, jewels, and luxury goods. They didn't build vast armies. They built fear, and that more than weapons made them powerful. What's most striking about this cult's culture is how different it was from their mainstream Egyptian contemporaries. Their artwork celebrated darkness, serpents, and stylized human violence, not order or divine harmony. Frescoes show assassins training, masked figures performing dark rites, and priests making offerings to chaotic gods. Even their gods are different, terrifying fanged figures often holding daggers, symbols of death, transformation, or terror. At the center of it all was the Tomb of Shadows, not a temple in a city, but a hidden complex in a desolate valley. It had massive hidden defensive systems, suggesting the cultists either felt insecure in their secrecy or projected enough power to make open defense unnecessary. Their confidence was architectural. Multi-story buildings carved into the rock, secret courtyards, and advanced trapping systems hinted at a society far ahead of its time in the arts of death. And yet, for all their sophistication, the cultists left behind no deciphered written records. Their primary script, a variant of hieratic, remains unreadable to this day. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what their masters believed, what prayers they spoke, or what truly happened behind the walls of this dark place. All we have are their ruins, their art, and their influence, whispered about later in Egyptian folklore and echoed in local myths. The cultists were not just builders of tombs, they were architects of mystery. And the Tomb of Shadows wasn't merely a building. It was the beating heart of a civilization of death that shimmered for a moment like a heat haze on the desert sand, and then vanished. But some say their echo still wanders the maze. To walk through the Tomb of Shadows is to walk through time. Layered, confusing, terrifying time. It's not just the scale that overwhelms you, it's the design. Rooms lead to rooms, corridors split and vanish. Light wells cut through the heart of the rock, creating disorienting shadows. Stairs spiral into darkness or emerge suddenly into sun-scorched pits. Nothing moves in a straight line. It's not hard to see why ancient visitors might have whispered labyrinth. The Tomb of Shadows wasn't just a base. It was a living organism. Spanning an estimated 150,000 square ft, the complex contained over 1,000 chambers, some tiny, some grand. These weren't randomly placed rooms. They were purpose-built workshops for poisons, storage spaces for weapons, dark shrines, living quarters, and training halls, all arranged around a large central cavern that may have hosted grim ceremonies or ritual combat. The complex was built on multiple levels up to 4 or 5 stories deep, in places using natural caves and artificial tunnels. To navigate it without getting lost, you'd need memory, instinct, or a map written in blood, like the legends say. And yet, this apparent chaos hides a remarkable intelligence. The cultists mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through air shafts and open stairwells. They funneled rainwater through hidden channels and had traps that could be reset long before anyone made it fashionable. One of the most iconic areas is the so-called Hall of Judgment, named for the obsidian chair built into the wall flanked by benches. Around it are frescoes of fanged demons, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a master assassin? A demon's chamber, a sacred court? No one knows for certain. And the walls, they speak in color. Vibrant frescoes show serpents swimming through rivers of blood. Men in dark kilts with bare chests. Youths leaping over pits of spikes midair. The art wasn't just decoration, it was identity. Violent, unnatural, deeply connected to chaos and death. Still, the deeper you go, the more the complex begins to disorient. Some parts seem intentionally complex, like they were designed to confuse. Maybe that's the root of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a headquarters that felt alive. A building that invited awe, ritual, and just a touch of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts. Just a place built to make you question where you were and what was waiting around the next corner. The Tomb of Shadows wasn't just an operational center or a secret residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the assassin's soul, steeped in ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Egyptian temples, there are no towering columns to Amun or golden shrines to Ra. Instead, the spiritual world of the Tomb of Shadows is more subtle, woven into the fabric of the building itself. Shrines hide in corners. Pillars rise like skeletal sentinels. Daggers, stylized, carved, symbolic, appear on rooftops and altars. Everywhere you look, the serpent motif dominates, suggesting a powerful connection between worship, the natural world, and this revered animal. The cultists didn't seem to fear the serpent. They celebrated it. The famous serpent-handling fresco in the tomb isn't just religious art. It may depict a deadly rite of passage. Young men and women handling a live cobra, locked in a dance of danger and grace. It wasn't sport. It was sacred theater, possibly an offering to their dark gods, or a symbolic triumph over fear. Then there are the demon statues discovered in storerooms beneath the complex. These fanged demon figurines are among the most iconic cult artifacts. bare-chested, arms raised, with daggers clutched in their hands or around their bodies. These figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols. They are guardians of the household, death, and perhaps chaos itself. To the cultists, snakes and daggers symbolized death, finality, and mystery. Creatures of both earth and underworld. The rooms where these objects were found hint at household shrines or ritual spaces, quiet, sacred corners hidden among the complex's bustling heart. Combined with the frescoes, the daggers, the altars, and the labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex begins to feel like a ritual machine, a structure built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine darkness. There is no centralized temple at the Tomb of Shadows because the complex itself was a temple. Its layout, art, and design were all part of a spiritual worldview where boundaries between sacred and secular didn't exist. This was a place where myth was architecture, where a corridor could become a passage to the gods of the underworld, and where every echo in the stone chambers may have once been a whispered prayer. The Tomb of Shadows didn't just house people, it housed demons. For centuries, the Tomb of Shadows stood as a beacon of terror, dark innovation, and cultural secrecy. But then, something happened, something sudden, something no one can fully explain. By around 100 BCE, the complex was abandoned, the frescoes left to fade, and the assassin cult that once ruled the shadows had vanished like mist over the Nile. So what happened? Theories abound. Some point to nature. Around 1200 BCE, a series of droughts and famines struck Egypt, destabilizing the new kingdom. A weakened state may have led to a crackdown on unofficial power centers, like the cult, devastating their network and funding. Upheaval may have blocked their trade routes, choking their income and disrupting their operations. While the Tomb of Shadows wasn't immediately destroyed, the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse may have shaken their foundations economically, politically, and spiritually. Others look to war. By 1150 BCE, the rising power of the Libyan tribes and sea peoples on Egypt's borders may have led the pharaohs to purge internal threats. Archaeological evidence suggests the Tomb of Shadows was raided violently and the culture had changed. The art was defaced. The coded hieratic script was replaced with curses written in standard hieroglyphs. The complex that once thrived with serpent priests and dagger wielders now whispered in the tongue of its enemies. Some scholars believe the state didn't conquer them in a single campaign, but gradually dismantled their network, first through spies, then arrests, and finally a full-scale military assault. Others argue that internal collapse, a civil uprising within the cult, political instability, or the failure of the leadership may have contributed just as much. What's striking, though, is how much violence is evident in the ruins. There are charred skeletons, signs of mass slaughter. The Tomb of Shadows didn't fall with a whisper. It fell with a scream. The great secret organization simply stopped. The rooms went quiet, the rituals ended, and nature slowly crept back in. By the time Greek historians wrote of Egypt, the Tomb of Shadows was already an ancient myth, a memory tangled in stories of demons, monsters, and labyrinths. And maybe that's fitting because what killed the cult wasn't just famine or invasion. It was time and the way all great things, no matter how terrifying, eventually vanish beneath the weight of new empires. But the bones remain, and if you listen closely, the maze still hums beneath the earth. For thousands of years, the Tomb of Shadows lay buried beneath the Theban sands. Just another mound of stone lost to time, its name forgotten, its myths distorted, its walls swallowed by rocks and dust. That is, until one man decided to chase a legend. His name was Sir Reginald Croft, and he didn't just rediscover the Tomb of Shadows, he reimagined it. In 1900, Croft, a British Egyptologist with a flair for drama and a deep love for dark myths, purchased the land that covered the ancient ruins. Local villagers had been finding strange daggers and artifacts, clues that something enormous lay beneath their feet. Croft dug in. What he found would change the history of the ancient Near East forever. He uncovered a complex so vast, so complex, and so advanced in its deadliness that he was convinced this was the mythical home of the demon god Medjed. The frescoes, the daggers, the sheer architectural strangeness of the site. It all pointed in his mind to one thing, the labyrinth of souls. Croft wasn't just an archaeologist, he was a storyteller and sometimes a controversial one. He named the people who built the tomb the Medjed cult after the demon. He interpreted symbols, reconstructed frescoes, and restored parts of the complex using reinforced concrete, a move that has drawn both praise and criticism. Some call it visionary, others call it vandalism. Because what you see today at the Tomb of Shadows is partly ancient ruin and partly Edwardian imagination. Still, Croft did what no one else had dared. He brought the Tomb of Shadows back to life. He gave the world a glimpse into a Bronze Age society far darker than classical Egypt, a civilization of murder, mystery, and shadowy elegance. He also unearthed the still undeciphered coded script, opening new questions about language, literacy, and the limits of our historical understanding. But Croft did more than excavate stone. He resurrected a myth and forced historians to reckon with the fact that behind the legend of the labyrinth was something real, something complex, something very human, a headquarters that felt like a maze, a civilization that slipped into shadow, and a man who peeled back the earth only to discover a story far stranger and more terrifying than he had imagined. The Tomb of Shadows had slept for 3,000 years. Croft rang the bell that woke it up. Walk through the Tomb of Shadows, and you're not just walking through architecture, you're walking through a language of symbols, frescoes, carvings, patterns. They're everywhere. But the cultists didn't leave us a Rosetta Stone. Their primary script, a coded hieratic, remains undeciphered. So instead of reading their thoughts, we must see them painted across plaster, carved into walls, and hidden in patterns. What exactly were they trying to say? The art of the Tomb of Shadows is unlike anything in the ancient world. There's no obsession with order, no rows of pharaohs or benevolent gods. Instead, we find chaos, coiling serpents, blooming poisonous flowers, birds of prey in flight, and sacred daggers. The humans are shadowy, elegant, and often dancing or performing rituals of death. Even in scenes that suggest danger, there's rhythm and brutality. The cultists weren't chronicling conquests. They were celebrating death cycles and possibly cosmic chaos. The most iconic symbol, though, is the crossed dagger or the serpent's tooth, found throughout the tomb in shrines, on frescoes, even etched into stones. The crossed dagger is believed to be a religious symbol, possibly tied to a death god or celestial cycles of destruction. Some suggest the very word labyrinth might derive from a lost term for this symbol, making the labyrinth not a maze at all, but a house of the crossed dagger, a sacred space, not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, here replaced by stylized bronze daggers placed at top walls and altars. These may have been religious markers separating sacred space from the mundane. Combined with frequent depictions of serpents and ritual killings, it's clear these acts had deep spiritual significance. Whether they represented power, chaos, fear, or a divine presence, no one agrees. But the dagger is everywhere. Even the layout of the tomb may have symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was built not just for function, but to mirror astronomical or seasonal patterns of darkness. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a journey through life, through death, through the underworld, a spiritual maze, not a physical prison. But without a deciphered script, every theory walks a thin line between insight and imagination. The cultists spoke in symbols, not stories. And so we're left to interpret. What is the Tomb of Shadows saying? We hear the rhythms. We see the images, but the meaning that remains just out of reach, like a thread unraveling into myth. The Tomb of Shadows is a ruin, Yes, but it doesn't feel dead. Walk its corridors today, and you'll sense something humming just beneath the surface. Not ghosts, not gods, but echoes of myths, of lives, of questions that refuse to go away. Thousands of years after its fall, the tomb still holds us in its maze. Tourists wander its halls, archaeologists dig for answers, and writers spin new tales inspired by its shadow. The smiter may be myth, but the feeling of the labyrinth is real. We don't know who ruled this cult. We don't know the names of its masters, killers, or priests. We don't know the prayers they whispered or the laws they lived by. But we know they loved secrecy. We know they worshipped chaos. We know they understood balance between architecture and death, between ritual and reality. And we know they were the first. Before the Hashashin, before the ninjas, before the Thuggee or the Roman Sicarii, there was the Medjid cult, a headquarters that was also a city that was also a temple that may have also been a story. Because perhaps that's what the labyrinth really is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the smiter didn't arise from nothing. It came from this place, from the confusion of its corridors, the reverence of its death rituals, and the awe it inspired in generations who tried to make sense of it. The locals turned it into a story. We turned it into archaeology. But at its core, the Tomb of Shadows has always been both. Today, we can walk its ruins in broad daylight. We can take photos, draw maps, and even reconstruct its frescoes. But the mystery hasn't vanished. The line between fact and legend still shimmers like heat over stone. Maybe that's why this place endures, because it doesn't give us all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to be felt. And the Tomb of Shadows, ancient, tangled, half-remembered, isn't just a place on a map. It's a question, one that leads us deeper with every step. And like a hero entering the maze, we're all still full. And it wasn't just the front door they were bypassing. Daggers were often used to strike weak points in security, assassinate watchmen, or kill sentries entirely. Their presence meant one thing: paranoia, or watch your defenses crumble like stale bread. The Hittites refined them. The Egyptians perfected them. Egyptian assassins carried small bronze daggers called BDs, small enough to hide in a loincloth. Some were so small they needed only a swift flick of the wrist to operate. And the rhythm of their deadly work was said to sound like whispers rolling across stone. And yet, for all their brute force, daggers required serious skill. Operators had to keep the blade hidden while also defending themselves from guards, dogs, and all manner of foul substances hurled from above. A dropped dagger was a dead assassin. Still, when a dagger got going, really going, it was unstoppable. Sharp bronze versus human flesh. It was ancient physics, weaponized, and it was only the beginning of how assassins would make powerful men weep. If the dagger was the brute, the poison was the tactician. Where daggers smashed close up, poisons attacked from a distance, launching not just death, but psychological dread. They were the first real silent killers in political history. And they revolutionized assassination by weaponizing biology in ways that felt almost magical to the enemy. The earliest poisons emerged from the Egyptian world around the 2nd millennium BCE, a product of brilliant minds who wanted to add range and deniability to warfare. The priests of Sekhmet, a cult with a taste for cutting-edge violence, commissioned the first venom-powered poisons, devices that used distilled snake or scorpion venom as their active ingredient. These weren't herbal teas for weaklings. They were precise instruments of political terror. The genius lay in their mechanics. Alchemists figured out that by mixing venoms with certain plants, often from the desert, they could create enormous amounts of lethal potential. When ingested, this force could cause paralysis, heart failure, or even horrifying hallucinations for hundreds of hours. The two main types evolved quickly: the fast-acting poison, which killed like a striking cobra, and the slow-acting poison which mimicked a disease, making a murder look like the will of the gods. Then came the assassins of the late period who never met an older idea they couldn't improve. They created poisons that could be dried, powdered, and sprinkled on clothing. Portable death for professional killers. Some Egyptian poisons could kill a 200 LB man with incredible speed, capable of tearing through a banquet, a private meeting, and occasionally an unlucky servant. Poisons weren't just about destruction. They were about spectacle. Ancient plotters used them to send messages, sometimes literally. Poisoned wine was sent as a gift to spread disease and fear. Poisoned figs were offered to rivals to shatter morale. In one chilling case, poisoned water sources were used to strike at entire garrisons as an early form of biological warfare. But poisons had their flaws. They were unstable, required skilled handlers, and could be rendered useless by a suspicious taster. Still, when used properly, they could batter a dynasty into submission from a safe distance. And for the first time in history, powerful men realized their thick palace walls didn't just need to withstand a dagger. They had to survive their own kitchens. Because now, destruction came in a cup. If the poison was clever, the strangulation cord was majestic, silent, creaking, and terrifying. It was the undisputed king of medieval and ancient assassination. When one appeared in a dark corridor, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement. It said, "Your guards mean nothing." Unlike its blade-powered cousins, the cord relied on leverage. At its core was a simple principle, a long woven cord, often of linen, wrapped around a throat with a heavy assassin on one end and a terrified victim on the other. Tighten the cord, let leverage do its work, and the target would go silent, dropping to the floor without a sound over enemy defenses. It was controlled destruction, precise, predictable, and devastating. The origin of the cord can be traced back to early models used by the Sumerians as early as the 4th millennium BCE, where brute force replaced finesse. But the garrote, the version that would rewrite assassination in Egypt and the ancient world, emerged in the New Kingdom, possibly through Hittite or Syrian intermediaries. Once Egypt got its hands on the design, it spread like wildfire through palaces and temples. The power was astonishing. A well-placed cord could silence a 300 LB guard in under 30 seconds. A man the size of a statue would crumple to the floor, pulverizing his own dignity and enemy morale. But the real magic was in the silence. Unlike daggers, cords could dispatch targets with finesse. This meant they weren't just bypassing defenses. They were eliminating sentries, guards, and watchmen inside. And it wasn't just for killing. Cords were used for everything. Tying up witnesses, climbing walls, setting traps to blind defenders, even sending messages or insults by leaving a knotted cord on a victim's chest. One legendary account from the harem conspiracy against Rameses III tells of multiple victims being strangled, a method so silent that the plot was almost successful. The pharaoh refused to believe it at first, just so he could maintain his composure. But for all its deadly glory, the cord wasn't fast-acting. It took seconds to apply, minutes to confirm the kill, and demanded a skilled practitioner. Still, no other assassination weapon combined stealth, force, and psychological horror quite like it. It was the ancient version of a slow-motion hammer from the heavens. And when that cord tightened, powerful men held their breath. While poisons killed from afar and daggers smashed the guards, infiltration took a more personal approach. It rolled right up to the enemy's front door and dropped off an armed invader. Imagine a human chameleon on 2 feet, covered in dirt to look like a peasant, bristling with hidden daggers and poisons. That was the master infiltrator, the ancient equivalent of a ghost and a mobile weapon in one. And when one of these started rumbling toward your city palace, you knew that the real fight was about to begin. Infiltrators weren't subtle in their goals. They were big, bold, and terrifyingly effective when used properly. The Egyptians may have been among the first to deploy them in the second millennium BCE, but it was the cults of the late period that took the design to theatrical extremes. During the political chaos of the 25th dynasty, one assassin known only as the Ghost, or Taker of Lives, was said to have infiltrated the palace of a Nubian pharaoh. He was over 6 ft tall, equipped with poisons, covered in sacred tattoos, and moved by a desire for revenge. He also disappeared without a trace. But the ambition unmatched. The logic behind infiltration was simple. Walls only work if you can't get over them. Infiltrators eliminated that advantage by creating a way to bypass guards, gates, and locked doors. From a hidden position, they could rain death down onto targets while the rest of the world prepared for another day. But these infiltrators weren't invincible. They were slow, vulnerable to being spotted, and prime targets for defenders with sharp eyes, loyal dogs, or even sabotaged terrain. Smart targets would have tasters, post extra guards, or build secondary inner defenses, known as counter-espionage measures, just to stop an infiltrator's approach. Still, when they worked spectacularly. A dead guard at the gate was one thing, but having your own bedchamber suddenly occupied by an enemy assassin, that was chaos. Infiltration transformed the battlefield from a contest of armies to a personal race for survival. They made heightened security an asset and a liability. And once the dagger was drawn by an infiltrator in the heart of the palace, there was no turning back. It was time for hand-to-hand hell. While daggers smashed and poisons soared, some of the most devastating assassination tactics happened silently underground. Psychological warfare, or Heka, was the dark art of defeating a target by removing the ground he stood on. Literally, the idea was ancient and horrifyingly effective. Undermine the enemy's mind, prop it up with false hope, then set that hope on fire. When the mind burned away, the tunnel of despair collapsed, taking the foundation of the target's sanity with it. One moment, your enemy stood strong. The next, a massive section of his support network crumbled like stale bread. This method didn't look glorious. There were no grand battles or thunderous charges, but psychological warfare was the slow, invisible killer of political warfare. The Egyptians practiced early versions of it, but the technique reached full maturity with the secret cults, political factions, and later Roman armies. During the reign of Akhenaten in 1350 BCE, the priests of Amun attempted psychological warfare beneath his new city, only for the defenders of the new faith to dig counter-propaganda and intercept them mid-campaign, turning the public square into a war of words nightmare. This defensive tactic became known as counterintelligence, and it added an eerie element to political warfare. Imagine agents digging in pitch black, hundreds of miles from home, listening for the sound of enemy whispers. The moment they heard tapping, they'd race to intercept, often resulting in violent claustrophobic skirmishes fought by torchlight with knives and lies. There was no glory in it, just terror, paranoia, and dirt. But when undermining worked, the results were catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples came in 1155 BCE during the Harem conspiracy against Rameses III. The plotters tunneled beneath his inner circle, packed the conspiracy with ambitious wives, and set it ablaze. The supports of his security collapsed, bringing down the entire regime's stability. The pharaoh was stunned, and though the plot was foiled, he soon after died. By the 12th century BCE, political engineers became specialists in identifying weak loyalties, measuring a court's behavior, and planning collapses with terrifying precision. They were psychologists and demolitionists rolled into one. And though this kind of warfare required time, labor, and a bit of madness, it proved one truth about political warfare. If you couldn't go over the wall, and you couldn't go through it, you could always take it down from below. Not all the drama of assassination warfare came from the attackers. For every dagger made or poison brewed, targets had their own deadly tricks. And sometimes those tricks were divine. Let's start with the most terrifying of them all. Curses, developed by the priesthoods around the 3rd millennium BCE. Curses were a mysterious magical weapon that could stick to assassins, plotters, and their families and keep burning even after death. Inscribed on tomb walls or hurled in verbal spells, they created scenes of pure chaos. To this day, no one knows exactly how they were supposed to work. The formula was so secret that it died with the Old Kingdom, but its effects legendary. Entire conspiracies were reduced to flaming skeletons of paranoia within minutes. And that was just the start. In more low-tech defenses, loyal guards were the go-to weapons of choice. Loyal medjay, nomarchs, or servants would be stationed in murder holes, those quaint openings in the ceilings of gateways or towers directly onto invaders below. Bodyguards were especially feared. Unlike curses, they clung to skin, soaking into clothes and armor before being set alight with their own fury. Imagine climbing a palace wall only to be greeted with a spear you could never put out. Loyal servants, though less dramatic, were vicious in their own right. They would slip into the gaps of a conspiracy, especially around the inner circle, causing 2nd and 3rd-degree burns to the plot as it cooked from within. It didn't look impressive from a distance, but it turned bold warriors into screaming wrecks in seconds. Targets also relied on the good old laws of architecture. Height became a weapon. Giant stones, logs, or even dead animals were dropped from parapets onto assassins or dense formations of troops. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to break the machines of conspiracy and morale at once. And then there were traps. Hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. Palaces became puzzles of pain designed to slow, confuse, and punish. All of this served one purpose: delay. Every minute a target survived was a minute closer to the enemy supply lines running thin, to disease spreading in their camps, or to reinforcements arriving. Assassination warfare was a game of attrition. And while the attackers had stealth on their side, the defenders had creativity and a whole lot of righteous rage. In assassination warfare, raw destruction was only half the goal. The other half was psychological domination, breaking the will of the plotters before the walls of their conspiracy even came down. Assassination weapons weren't just tools of war. They were massive, creaking, flaming symbols of doom. Every whisper of a hidden dagger, every arcing rumor flung by a spy was designed to plant one seed in the minds of those in power. You are not safe. Ancient commanders knew this. The Egyptians paraded their security openly, dragging them across deserts with grand fanfare. The Romans built their fortifications right in view of the enemy, letting defenders watch as battering rams were assembled and catapults tested. Politics was theater, and fear was part of the script. Sometimes the payloads themselves carried a message. Severed heads of messengers or generals would be launched over the walls, often still wearing their armor. At the siege of Avaris, defenders were bombarded not only with rocks, but with bodies. Diseased corpses launched to spread panic and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, it's believed that hurling plague-infected corpses over the walls helped trigger outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The poison wasn't just a weapon, it was an announcement. When one of these deadly concoctions was rolled into place, everyone inside the palace could feel it before they saw it. The creaking of fear, the grinding of suspicion, the heavy thunk of a dead food taster, like the heartbeat of an incoming storm. But the most dangerous part, the unknown. You never knew what was coming next. Would it be a dagger, a cup of poison, a rain of arrows, or just silence? Ominous, heavy silence as assassins adjusted their aim. Even the sounds became psychological weapons. The rhythmic beat of paranoia or the sudden silence before a strike would drive targets mad with anticipation. For plotters, the goal was to create despair, to convince the enemy that resistance was pointless, that their gods had abandoned them, that their walls were nothing but temporary obstacles in the path of fate. And when that mental dam finally cracked, the gates of power often opened without a fight. Because in assassination warfare, sometimes the mind collapsed before the body. As gunpowder thundered onto the battlefield in the late medieval era, the age of traditional assassination came to a slow, splintering end. But their legacy didn't vanish. It evolved. The invention of organized intelligence services changed everything. A single well-placed spy could do in seconds what an assassin took hours to achieve. Powerful figures once considered impenetrable became liabilities. By the 15th century, the great conspiracies of Europe were crumbling, not from daggers or poison, but from betrayal crashing through their parapets. Assassination warfare had entered its next phase, explosive, brutal, and deafening. And yet the principles laid down by ancient assassins never disappeared. Modern intelligence still owes a debt to the poisoner and the dagger wielder. Every covert operation and long-range strike is just a high-tech descendant of the same question. How do you break what's meant to be unbreakable from a distance? Stealth, trajectory, deception, and force, all discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder ever entered the story. Even military psychology today, shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, visible dominance, has its roots in ancient assassination tactics. Those shadowy assassins rolling forward with daggers snapping in the dark were the original shock and awe. They weren't just about breaching a wall. They were about breaking the spirit of a regime. You can still see their legacy etched into the ruins of ancient cities. At Thebes, where Ramesses III's tomb still bears the record of his assassins. At Amarna, where layers of intrigue stood for 1,000 years against every machine imaginable. Until political fire finally brought them down at palaces across the world, where round-the-clock security and armored vehicles tell the story of a world constantly redesigning itself to survive the next assassination. And today, even in a world of drones and satellite-guided missiles, assassination warfare hasn't vanished. It's just gone digital. Leaders are still surrounded. Defenders are still isolated. Walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. But the soul of the assassination remains the same. Someone wants in, someone wants to keep them out, and both are willing to wait, build, and break to win. The daggers are gone, the poisons are museum pieces, but the spirit of assassination warfare, it's as alive and as destructive as ever.